Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Stern, and I'm the founder and president of EMET, and it's my profound pleasure to welcome you to yet another very timely and very topical weekly webinar. On June 9th, 1967, when I was a little girl, my parents got all of us siblings together, and we boarded a bus from White Plains, New York, and attended a massive rally on Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., where more than 50,000 Jews from all around the country and from every segment of the Jewish religious and political community were united in solidarity and support for the State of Israel. The almost palpable fear over Israel's existence that gripped everyone present was only rivaled by the magnificent display of Jewish unity. I wonder today how many American Jews follow the negotiations in Vienna with the same careful attention to minute detail that some of us do, and who understand that what is at stake here is truly existential. Do they follow these issues with the same attention to detail as American Jews did prior to the events leading up to the 1967 war? If Israel were forced to attack Iran, how many American Jews would understand and have empathy for the very existential threat an Iranian nuclear bomb poses to the State of Israel and to the rest of the world? Or would they simply buy into the State Department and the media spin that Israel is undermining the negotiations in Vienna? What has happened to American Jewry in the years since 1967? Here to talk first about the demographic issues is Jonathan Tobin. Jonathan is perhaps the most knowledgeable and insightful public intellectual and writer about all aspects of things relating to Israel and the Jewish people that we currently have on the scene today. Jonathan is editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, an international wire service covering the Jewish world in Israel. He's also a senior contributor for the Federalist and a columnist for Newsweek, the New York Post, Haaretz and Israel Hayom, as well as a regular contributor for other publications such as the Washington Examiner and Commentary. He covers the American political scene, foreign policy, the U.S. Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, and the Jewish world. Previously to becoming editor of JNS, Jonathan was executive editor, senior online editor, and chief political blogger for Commentary magazine. He also served as editor-in-chief of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia and editor of the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. Jonathan has won more than 60 awards, including top columnist for Jewish publications 10 times, and most recently in 2018 and 2019. He appears regularly on television commentating on politics in the United States and Israel, foreign policy, and Jewish affairs, and lectures on college campuses and to Jewish communities. Jonathan was born in New York City, attended local schools, and studied history at Columbia University. Jonathan, so what has happened? Can you walk us through some of the demographics and why it seems that there is no longer this passionate obsession with the survival of the State of Israel?
Well, first, Sarah, thank you for inviting me to join this webinar and speak for EMET. You have a great organization, and we're happy to cover you. And you know, Sarah writes for us at jns.org, and we certainly encourage everyone to log on every day to see our fresh material. We cover the Jewish world and Israel in a way that is quite different from most other sources, and we look forward to having more readers, and when you do log on, you'll see why JNS is so important. The question about the divide between America and American Jews and Israeli Jews is one that has flummoxed a great many Jews who care deeply about Israel. And like Sarah, they think back on what happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and say, gee, why are things different? Why isn't it the same passionate rallying around the flag that previous generations took for granted? And the answer that we get from a lot of people is that it's about politics. We're told that Israel's behavior has turned people off, that American Jews don't like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. They also cite issues like the lack of religious pluralism in Israel, where Reform and conservative Jews understand that their rabbis are not recognized as rabbis in Israel, or at least are not paid by the state and recognized by the state as other rabbis are, as Orthodox rabbis are. All these issues are sort of thrown in to create this impression that it's Israel's fault. Israel is doing things that offend the sensibilities of American Jews, that are different from their conception of what Judaism is or what it means to have Jewish identity. And I think, on one foot, I would say that's basically wrong. That's looking at it from the wrong end of the telescope. Now, of course, many American Jews don't like Prime Minister Netanyahu. Of course, not a lot of Israelis don't like him either. That's why they keep having elections there. But the point about American Jewish criticisms of Israel is that for the most part, American Jews aren't alienated from Israel because of what it does, but because of what it is. Because it is a sectarian, avowedly Jewish state. And that's a big difference because American Jews have been raised. We're speaking of generations that are not immigrants, people who did not grow up in the shadow of the Holocaust. They grew up in a free United States, which is the freest, richest, and in many ways, most successful diaspora community in the history of the Jewish people. And in a country like the United States, which is founded on universal ideas, the idea of a mosaic or a melting pot where all peoples come together, the idea of just being Jewish, and that's your defining characteristic, really goes against the grain, probably for the overwhelming majority of American Jews, especially the up to 90% who do not identify as Orthodox, who are either Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, or as the surveys, the demographic surveys tell us, are in the largest, in the fastest growing group, who are people who are defined by the pollsters as Jews of no religion, people who identify in one way or another, loosely or not, as Jewish, but who do not either affiliate with a synagogue or a movement, or really have strong connections in the way that perhaps previous generations took for granted. It's a very different thing. The point here is that the problem that really animates the divide between Israel and America is not politics, it's demography. It's about a changing American Jewish population that, for many of whom, have lost a sense of what we call Jewish peoplehood. This is not necessarily about religion. It's about identifying as a member of the Jewish people and having strong connections, seeing Israel as integral to your life and your identity. That was a lot easier to understand in 1967 or in the years before that, because Israel was something that we sort of identified with. I mean, one of the there were two factors there. On the one hand, Israel was still seen as the poor, struggling victim, the potential victim of another Holocaust, the underdog struggling to survive. Well, the good news about that is that Israel is not still struggling to survive. It has, instead of the ragtag third world economy, if you could even call it that, of 50 or 60 years ago, it is now a startup nation first world economy. It's in the region, it's the most successful economy in the Middle East. It also is a regional military superpower. It is stronger, wealthier than it has ever been in the 73 years of its history. And it is not a victim state. The whole point of Zionism was for Jews to re-enter the world stage as actors, not merely people who are dependent on the kindness of others. And Israel has done that. It has secured its existence. It has defended itself. It has won wars. One of the iron rules of popularity of Jews, and it's an unpleasant thing to say, but the fact is dead Jews are very popular. Everybody sympathizes with the victims of the Holocaust, the 6 million. The live Jews of Israel, nearly 7 million, they're not so popular because they're not victims. They're not underdogs. And certainly in the press likes to pick an underdog, and they pick the Palestinians. But to get back to the question of demography, it's true, as I said, that American Jews are overwhelmingly liberal. They vote for the Democratic Party overwhelmingly. And they are a center-left, if not left, population politically. Israel is a center-right country politically. That's why it keeps electing, even though Netanyahu can't get a majority, the vast majority of the members of the Knesset are on the right in terms of security issues. That is a divide, that is a disconnect. But it's also a disconnect that goes far deeper than what do you think about Netanyahu, or what do you think about settlements, or where do you think the borders of Israel should be drawn? It goes to where you think the purpose of Judaism is. So many American Jews grow up in this country and think of social justice, which is a fine thing, but that the idea of liberal, modern American liberal politics, that is what defines Judaism. And when you put Israel and its problems and its needs, as well as its achievements into that mix, there's a disconnect there. It doesn't fit in. Zionism, strong Jewish nationalism, is somewhat alien to many American Jews. And this is partly, as I say, a problem of politics, and it's partly a question of what kind of a country America is, which is, the last best hope of mankind, as we've always conceived of it. And it is not about one group demographic or one ethnic or religious group. It's about many groups. Israel is the Jewish state. It was created to have a home for a persecuted people and to defend Jewish identity. That's a very different thing from the United States. But that is exacerbated by something that is all too familiar to everyone who lives in the United States now, and that is the way our demography has changed. It's a plain fact that the overwhelming majority of American Jews who are not Orthodox are intermarried or are intermarrying. And that does not mean that they're all alienated from Judaism or don't have pride in Judaism. In fact, the seminal Pew study of American Jewry from 2013 showed that the overwhelming majority were proud of being Jewish. But what they conceived of being Jewish wasn't what we traditionally thought of. They thought of food, they thought of humor. All the things about religious law or even Zionism were way down on the list for them. And as people who intermarry and the children of intermarriage, of course, many of whom are strong members of the community, and yet it creates a disconnect. It's a group of people who see themselves more in terms of being Americans and of not having the defining characteristic about their lives being Jewish. It's only natural that they're going to have a harder time understanding or feeling close to a sectarian Jewish state, even one that's democratic, the most liberal country in the Middle East. It's still a harder sell. As for other issues, I mentioned pluralism. That certainly is a bone of contention between Reform conservative Jews and Israel. I would just say on one foot, what most American Jews fail to understand is that Israel is a country, for better or for worse, and I think often it's for worse, has no divide, has no church-state separation. Religion, the synagogues are paid by the state, the rabbis are paid by the state. And in a country where rabbis are paid by the state, the question of who is a rabbi is inherently political. The Orthodox movements have, and sects have the votes. There are very few or relatively few Reforming conservative Jews in Israel. They do not. And that's where that issue stands. And any government of Israel is necessarily going to put that issue of pluralism, even though I think many Israeli Jews are very sympathetic to it and resent the rule of the rabbinate, it's just not a priority for them. There's another factor to take into effect, and I mentioned earlier about how the majority of American Jews are liberal politically, loyal Democrats. Up to 70% consistently vote for Democrats in presidential elections. And the antagonism between the Democratic Party and Israel has played a factor in that alienation. The two political parties in the United States have more or less, they've switched identities about Israel in the last 60 years. Couple of generations ago, Republicans were sort of so-so about Israel. Some were supportive, some were indifferent, some weren't particularly supportive at all. Democrats seem to be more or less a lockstep pro-Israel party. Today, that's completely different. The Republicans are now a lockstep pro-Israel party. There are virtually no members of Congress who are Republicans who aren't enthusiastic supporters of Israel. On the other hand, the Democrats, while there are still strong pro-Israel members, they're divided, and their young activist wing, the left wing of the party, is frankly, it's bought into intersectional myths about Israel being an oppressor state, and that the Palestinian war on Israel being somehow analogous to the struggle for civil rights in the United States, linked to all sorts of toxic critical race theories as well. That has created a lot of hostility for Israel among certain sectors of the Democratic Party. The two members of Congress who are supportive of the anti-Semitic BDS movement, Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, they're popular figures within the Democratic Party, like their buddy, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. So there is a strong current against Israel among Democrats, and that carries over to American Jews. And it's only natural, really, because we live in the most hyper-partisan moment, certainly in modern American political history, and at a moment when, for many, if not most Americans, politics has taken on the role that religion used to play. That's why our arguments are so bitter and so nasty, and why Americans are so polarized. Indeed, one of the most interesting statistics I've come across in recent years is the fact that when you poll people about who their children should marry, in the late 1950s, the overwhelming majority of Americans didn't want their children to marry outside of their race to a person of a different color, and also didn't want their children to marry outside of their religion. That was overwhelming majorities were against it. Today, most Americans don't care about either of those things, interestingly enough. And then interracial marriage, and certainly interfaith marriage, and we certainly know that's true from the statistics among Jews. Jews don't care about that issue. However, the interesting thing is that the vast majority of Americans, Jewish, non-Jewish, are overwhelmingly opposed as they used to be about religion and race, to their children marrying somebody from a different political party. Think about that. And that has created where the Democrats are at odds with Israel. And certainly that was embodied by the ongoing spats between former President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, the debate about the Iran nuclear deal. That created a certain degree of alienation. But as I said, that's only the surface. At the heart of it is who American Jews are as a people. If they are not comfortable, if they don't feel a sense of peoplehood, and not comfortable with the sectarian Jewish state, a state that is devoted to the mission of protecting the Jewish people, of giving it a home, and its right of self-defense, there's always going to be that alienation, that universalism versus parochialism. And on top of all that, the atmosphere for, especially for young Jews who are probably the most vulnerable about this alienation, is the atmosphere on campuses, where the academic fashion is to embrace these intersectional myths, these really lies that support the BDS movement, and which sees Israel as an expression of white privilege, as an oppressor state, an apartheid state. This creates a very difficult atmosphere for young people who want to fit in. There are always some outliers who want to fight back, but it's very hard for kids. It's hard enough for adults, people in the public square, to speak truth to power. Much harder for young people, for students, and that creates a real problem for young Jews who don't want to stick out, don't want to fight, and don't think it's fashionable to stand up for Israel or identify with Israel, or in some cases even to identify as Jews, because wherever the BDS movement goes, wherever it raises its banners, acts of anti-Semitism always follow. So we have this problem. And as I said, it's mostly about demography, partly about politics, but let's remember something else. Demography is not necessarily destiny. The Jewish people, the cause of Israel in this country, the cause of the Jewish people, is not necessarily lost simply because of intermarriage statistics or political affiliations. Israel and Jewish identity still has the ability to inspire young Jews, to help create Jewish families, and to create a whole new generation of people who care about Israel. Yes, it's not likely that they're going to be storming Washington on behalf of Israel, or even on behalf of Soviet Jewry, as Jews did it as late as the 1980s. But we can't give up hope for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's not a Jewish thing to do. One of the things that we have to always remember is that the essence of being a Jew throughout our history has been a willingness to stand up and to resist the idols of popular culture, wherever they are. Being a Jew means going against the grain. And sometimes I think in our discussions of how we can help Jewish kids, and yes, we have to support more Jewish education, Jewish camps, trips to Israel. These are all vital things. We have to equip young people, as well as older people, with all the facts and the knowledge about what's really going on in Israel, vis-a-vis Iran, the Palestinians, not so that they won't be victims of the myths and the lies. But we also need one more thing, and that's something that we can all model. And in many ways, it's even more important, and that is courage. The courage to stand up and to be a Jew when being a Jew isn't popular, when being a Zionist isn't popular, when standing up for the Jewish people means that you're going to stick out. And yet that is exactly what we need as a group, as a people, and as individuals as well. That courage is what has sustained the Jewish people. That faith in our future and in our destiny has helped drive us for centuries, for millennia. We can't lose sight of that, even as we lament demographic problems or political problems, or just the general dilemma of living in the 21st century in a world where big tech controls so much and our lives seem so different and isolated. We have the power to inspire ourselves, our children, our community. And we start by speaking up, by learning the truth and advocating for it. That's the most important message I can leave for you today. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Jonathan, thank you. I can't thank you enough for your wisdom and your insights, but moreover, for your very inspiring, uplifting words, because as you know, we at EMET very often find ourselves running against the grain. And I personally have been in many situations where I've raised my hand and certain think tanks, and had to just be the person, because there was no one else there to, have this courage to break all this mythology. And it's not comfortable. And I think our message is to inspire this in young people. And they just, they need more role models and more examples. And I have a first question, and then we were going to open up the floor to questions. And I see a lot have come in, at least 17 right now. And I hope we'll have a chance to get to all of them. I apologize if we don't. So intellectual history right now, in the United States is going away from the particular to the more universal. And it seems very taboo to be nationalistic or even patriotic. And certainly groups like the Proud Boys have not helped, and I feel that it's really ironic that as we are going away, and we're taught, and even there was a time in, I think, in the educational ministry in Israel, where they were emphasizing the universalist rather than the particular, and they changed the textbooks to reflect more empathy towards the Palestinians. I find it very ironic, though, that as it's considered taboo for us to have a sense of pride in Israeli nationalism and Israeli accomplishments, that so many of us are very concerned about Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian, and and are really working towards a two-state solution and Palestinian statehood, despite the fact that if you read, their rhetoric, they do not really want two states living side by side in peace and democracy. So can you comment a little bit about that? Why is this?
Yeah, it's kind of a disease of the West, in that, I think Gilbert and Sullivan had a line in one of their operettas about people who will, honor every nation and every age but their own. And it's certainly true among contemporary, modern Western intellectuals to despise their own countries, to see them as irredeemably flawed, or as we now have, it's a major movement within, certainly within the United States, to, exemplified by the New York Times' fallacious 1619 project, which, brands America as irredeemably racist from its beginnings. This is fundamentally false, but a lot of people buy into it. And we see, Americans see, too many Americans see other peoples as somehow, as I mentioned, intersectionalism before. They see all the world is divided into basically by race. You define people, are they a victim class, a victim race, or an oppressor race? And they define Israel as an expression of white privilege or imperialism, which is, utterly false. Certainly by the definitions of people of color that are commonly used on the left, the vast majority of Israeli Jews are people of color, because, they're not descendants of people who came from Europe. They're people who came from the Middle East, Mizrahim. So, it's founded on a lie, but it has a very real impact, since it sees third world peoples, oppressed people. The Palestinians are seen as victims. Now, if you take the long view of history, that's kind of crazy. Who has been a victim more often than the Jews? But because we're not currently being herded into death camps, Jews don't qualify as victims anymore, and because Israel has chosen to survive rather than to succumb, it is seen as Goliath rather to the Palestinian David. Again, these are false narratives, false about Israel, false about the United States. And but it has become, it has become, sort of orthodoxy in academia. Middle East studies are dominated by people who see the world that way, who are anti-Zionist. Frankly, Israel studies, which is a new field that grew up to counter the way that Middle East studies was, dominated by Arabists and anti-Zionists, Israel studies is now dominated by people who buy into some of the same noxious myths. So we have to push back. And like so many other really bad things that started out in academia, it's migrated to the public square. That's why we're having a lot of the debates that we're having. So what is needed is to not accept, false narratives. Don't accept the parameters, the legitimacy of the question. Israel is not an apartheid state. It is a democratic state. It is a fundamentally liberal state. And so much, and what so many American Jews who buy into these lies don't understand is that the causes they're being told to sympathize with are fundamentally illiberal. They're against the basic values of democracy that we think of as traditionally liberal. Israel is a liberal state. So, it's just, it's a disconnect between truth and reality. And it needs to be refuted at every step. And part of the problem is that, sort of among intellectuals, these are not merely treated as merely fashions, but they're treated as orthodoxy. And that is something that can't be accepted. It has to be refuted at every step. So, we have to start from there.
Great. Now I'm going to turn the podium over to our wonderful director of EMET's program for Israel's national security, Benjamin Whale, who will read the questions that have come in. Benjamin.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jonathan, for your time and for speaking with us today. The first question is, as you mentioned, the majority of Jews here in the United States tend to lean left, while in Israel they lean right. But when you look at other Jewish communities around the world, particularly in Europe, where they also tend to be more liberal, why is there less friction between those Jewish communities and Israel as opposed to that of between the American Jewish community and the Israeli one? What here in the United States or in politics or environment causes that gap?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't know that I can give you a definitive answer. I can listen. The difference between American Jewry and European Jewry is Americans, for all of the fact that we here in the United States, often with good reason, are constantly decrying anti-Semitism and threats to us from anti-Semites. American Jews are fundamentally secure in this country. It's kind of a false narrative. The Anti-Defamation League, makes a lot of money, basically telling Jews to be afraid. And it's not as if that there aren't horrible anti-Semites on the far right as well as on the left. But American Jews, they're here as of not of sufferance, but of right, but the same as everybody else. And it gives a very different point of view. European Jews certainly are under fire. The situation in the cities of major cities of Western Europe is, you can't walk around with a chai around your neck. You can't wear a kippah without taking your life into your hands. And I think for European Jewish communities, as much as that, many of them, as you say, lean to the left, certainly British Jewry does. But I think there's a more natural understanding that Israel lives in a dangerous neighborhood. And I think there might be a little less willingness to buy into the sort of conventional wisdom that Israel is the obstacle to peace and that Israel is the problem. As much as there are forces working on those Jewish communities that are, the situation in Europe where there's this, bizarre alliance of Islamists and migrants from Muslim countries and left-wing intellectual elites, all uniting to support anti-Zionism and of hatred of Israel and frankly of Jews. It's a very different situation here. I mean, American Jews really believe, many of them really believe, it's not just that they believe in a two-state solution, which in a rational world might be would be a very logical solution to the problem of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But Israelis understand, as you alluded to, Sarah, the Palestinians have repeatedly rejected peace under a two-state solution. They could have had a Palestinian state many times. They have a independent Palestinian state in all but name in Gaza already. And I think American Jews are just kind of very unrealistic. I mean, Israeli Jews, we in America used to speak, 20, 30 years ago, routinely that Israel is divided. It's split between right and left about the peace process. That hasn't been true for a very long time. Israel isn't split on the peace process. It's split on many other things, namely the fate of Benjamin Netanyahu. But there's a broad consensus in Israel that there is no option for peace right now, that giving up the West Bank, as American Jews, as Democrats seem to be advising them all the time, wouldn't be so much unwise as insane under the circumstances, since the Palestinians won't recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state no matter where its borders are drawn. So I think there's perhaps more recognition of Israel's real dilemmas by some of those other communities, whereas in the United States, that's harder. Now, again, let me go back for a second to demography. There is a difference within American Jews, within American Jewry, among those who are conservative or those who are Orthodox, which is still a small group. They're much more pro-Israel. They're also more conservative, more likely to vote for Republicans. The difference between those two groups, the sort of majority on the left, the minority on the right, it's growing greater just because America is more polarized as well. So that's another factor that we have to take into account.
And if I may add, I think that the United States, unlike many other countries around the world, is heavily invested in Israel, not only financially, but also policy-wise. And therefore, it's easier for Jews here in the United States who are involved in politics to weigh in on Israeli politics. And obviously that adds a little tension.
Yeah, well, the truth is, I mean, people in this country, certainly Jews in this country, have sort of involved themselves in Israeli politics vicariously for a couple of generations. It's sort of a form of entertainment. They root for, it's a normal thing. There are all these organizations, charitable organizations, American Friends of fill in the blank in Israel. People feel the same way about the two sides, the various sides, I should say, in Israeli politics, and feel very free. And there's nothing wrong about that. There's nothing wrong with having an opinion about Israeli politics. Israelis have opinions about Israeli politics, and they get up every, one of the things is always Zionists say criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. That's not true. I mean, 7 million Israeli Jews get up every day and criticize their government, just like 330 million Americans get up every day and criticize their government. Question is whether there is going to be an Israel. Whether a question about Israel is not criticizing it, is whether there should be one. That is still a point of contention. That is still something the Palestinians want to erase, and the Iranians and other Islamists want to erase.
And speaking of Jewish organizations, one of the questions that we received is, how are Jewish organizations and figures such as J Street or Senator Sanders responsible for mobilizing liberal American Jewish opinions against Israel?
Well, certainly, I think, I alluded to before, I think, the politics of the left plays a role in American Jewish attitudes. But let me sort of step back for that a minute. I think J Street gets a lot of attention. It's very good at getting attention. You got to take your hat off to them. They're great at getting sympathetic articles in the New York Times, and posing as the voice of American Jewry. But in truth, they're really irrelevant. I mean, they're irrelevant for two reasons. Number one, their point of view about, if you take them at their word that they're pro-Israel and pro-peace, and what they really want is a two-state solution, their point of view is represented by a tiny minority of Israeli voters. They're really out of touch with the vast majority of Israelis, really from center left all the way to the right. So in that sense, they're irrelevant. They're also increasingly irrelevant because within the left of American Jewry, within the left of the United States, they're being outflanked by anti-Zionist groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, who are openly anti-Zionist, in many ways openly anti-Semitic. But but who have a sort of easier brand to sell for young left-wingers, because they don't try to, they don't dilute their anger about Israel, anger about Israel's existence. J Street, Jeremy Ben-Ami says he's pro-Israel, pro-peace, and sometimes one wonders, but I'll take his word for that. But that's too Zionist for a lot of people on the left, and I think they've lost ground there. They're great at getting politicians, liberal politicians, to attend their conferences. Certainly, Bernie Sanders has a natural home there. Elizabeth Warren spoke there over the weekend, basically doing what Democrats really hate when saying what the Russia supposedly did in the United States. She's trying to intervene in Israeli politics, which is a long tradition of Americans trying to intervene in Israeli politics. But I think J Street isn't as important as it thinks it is. Frankly, it isn't as important as a lot of people on the Jewish right think it is, for whom it's sort of the bête noire. They're really, it gets under a lot of people's skin, but they're really not that big. They are not nearly as big a deal as they think they are.
Yeah, and given the current shifts inside the Democratic Party, do Jewish Democrats have leverage inside the party to push back against the young anti-Israel bent? And how can they do so while being loyal to the Democratic establishment?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and the short answer is yes, of course they can. Pro-Israel Democrats, and yes, some people on the right say there's no such thing, but of course there are. There are many pro-Israel Democrats, and indeed within the Congressional Caucus of the Democratic Party, the vast majority of Democrats in Congress are, they may not be pro-Likud, they may not be sympathetic to Netanyahu, but they're not hostile to the existence of the state of Israel. Some of them are very strong supporters, people like Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, or Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey. I mean, these are not people who are anti-Israel. But the trouble is that sort of all the energy within the Democratic Party lately seems to be among the squad, AOC, Ilhan Omar, and the left. They're the ones, indeed, they seem to be calling the shots for the Democratic Party at times right now. And it's harder for these older, and certainly the leadership of the House, leadership of the Democrats in the House is, a gerontocracy. They're 78, 79, 80. They have real issues pushing back. And so there is, and again, there is the force of partisanship. In America right now, everybody's picked a side. There's nobody in the middle, seemingly. If you're on the side of the Democrats, you're against the Republicans, you're against the Jews who are Republicans, and you're against what you may perceive as an Israel, which is aligned more with the Republicans. But again, that has its backwards. Israel seems to get along better with the Republicans in recent years because the Republicans are so pro-Israel. The interesting thing is, many Jewish Democrats say that Republicans are trying to use Israel as a wedge issue, and they're destroying the bipartisan consensus on Israel. That's not really true. The Republicans joined the bipartisan consensus on Israel. It's the Democrats who are jumping off the bipartisan consensus on Israel. And the Iran issue was a great example. Up until 2014, 2015, the vast majority of Democrats in Congress were really hawks on Iran for strong sanctions against any kind of appeasement of Iran. But President Obama was able to skillfully make it a partisan litmus test. He had a little help from Netanyahu there. I know some people might disagree with me on that, but I think it's true. And so they all wound up lining up with Obama. If it was Obama versus Netanyahu, they picked Obama. Ironically, Obama is but the least popular American president as far as Israelis have ever been concerned. He's deeply beloved by the majority of American Jews who are Democrats. So again, there's that partisan disconnect. But to get back to your question, can Jewish Democrats push back against this anti-Israel tide? Of course they can. Of course they can, but they haven't, because the centrifugal pull of partisanship, in which you don't criticize anybody on your side. You only see anti-Semitism from your political opponents. Now that happens on the right and the left. There are people on the right who cannot see anti-Semitism on the far right. But it's also true that most Jewish Democrats have a lot of trouble seeing anti-Semitism, the very virulent anti-Semitism on the left, which is mostly identified with anti-Zionism, and which that Congressional House squad certainly embodies.
Can I just add something very quickly right there? And because, I have decades and decades of experience on Capitol Hill, and I've been watching how, it has been more and more difficult to pass legislation because you need, to be bipartisan in order to get passed, particularly today. And, I'm feeling that the one thing that these older Jewish Democrat policymakers are lacking right now is what you had made an appeal for, and that's political courage. They do not want to go against the grain of where they see what you call this centrifugal force in their party. And it's been phenomenally disappointing for me, just phenomenally. Anyhow, I'm sorry, Benji, go ahead and read the next question that's coming.
Thank you. One of our audience members asks, you have openly criticized establishment Jewish organizations for failing to protect the community against Jew hatred stemming from leftists, Islamists, and Farrakhaners. Why do you think this is happening? And what do you think the center or right-leaning Jewish organizations should do?
Well, I think it's happening because some of those organizations now prize their political alliances with fellow left-wingers who are not Jewish more than they do their obligation to defend the Jewish people. Obviously, I'm talking about the Anti-Defamation League, which has really dropped its, sadly, former bipartisan, nonpartisan stance and become something like a Democratic auxiliary group. That's really awful, because I have to say, if there are many national Jewish organizations, the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish American Organizations has a lot of organizations that aren't so major, and long since lost their sense of purpose or really their mission. They're obsolete. They're really vestigial functions. But the ADL still has a job, and an important job, monitoring anti-Semitism, standing up against. We need a strong, vital, active ADL. What we don't need is an ADL that basically is enlisted to fight, partisan battles on behalf of liberals and Democrats, or on behalf of conservatives and Republicans. We need the ADL to be what it used to be. Under its current leader, Jonathan Greenblatt, who took over from Abe Foxman in 2015, he's a former Clinton and Obama staffer. It's just gotten very partisan, and frankly, it's been very good business for them. That is what his liberal donor base wants. It wants liberal politics. It doesn't want traditional, traditional defense of the Jews and defense of Israel in that same way. I think that's tragic. As to what the other organizations can do, well, they have to step into the breach to the extent that they can, and do the job that needs to be done. They have to push back against it. It's not easy, it's very hard being the dog in the manger, as they say. Again, it requires a certain degree of courage. It requires a certain degree of willingness to take insults and abuse. That goes with the territory if you're in public life. But Jewish organizations that are often ruled by, what I like to call a cult of consensus, that doesn't go naturally for many. Certainly for many Jewish leaders and certainly Jewish lay leaders, they don't get into this to be called names or to have fights. They want to do some good. But sometimes what we need to do is just stand up and fight. And with respect to the abdication of groups like the ADL and lately the JCPA, the Jewish Council of Public Affairs, where they're endorsing people with histories of anti-Semitism because nominees to federal office, because they're Biden appointees, because they either want access or because they're just naturally sympathize with them. That's abandoning their brief to defend the Jews and to fight against anti-Semitism. And it's up to those of us who can see the truth to speak up against it.
Thank you. And another question that came in is, if more Jews migrate to the Republican Party, do you think that might make the Democrats rethink their positions? And do you see this even happening?
I'll answer the last question first, and the answer is no. As I said before, we're in a highly, the most hyper-partisan moment in certainly modern American political history. The Jewish Republicans, God bless them, they have been working since Reagan, chasing after the chimera of mass conversion of liberal Jews to support the Republicans. It's not happening. What is happening, though, is that they can maintain their base of that 30% or so. It might be in the long run, it may grow just because of demographic reasons, because the Orthodox community has stronger continuity. It's growing, and they're more likely to be conservatives and Republicans. But they need to tamp down their triumphalism about that too. It's going to be many, many decades, if ever, that the Orthodox become the majority of American Jews. That's not going to happen in anybody's, it's unlikely to happen in our lifetimes. It happened into your lifetime. You're a little younger than me. So that's not the point. No, that's not happening anytime soon, but that doesn't mean that those who care about Israel can't speak up and support those people who support Israel. If it's Republicans, great. If it's Democrats, that's great too. I'm not here to advocate for either political party, but for Jews to stand up for people who are supportive of Israel, supportive of the rights of the Jewish people. That's what we need to do. We need to be smart about that. Unfortunately, it's harder and harder to do that because, as I said, we're in the middle of really American politics is a tribal culture war in which there is no middle ground, and there really doesn't seem to be much communication, let alone room to cross over between Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives.
And speaking of communication, the next question asks, they say that language unites people and nations. Do you think that more people should learn Hebrew to help bridge this divide that we've been discussing between American and Israeli Jewry?
Well, absolutely. Hebrew is absolutely vital to the future of, it's the national language of the Jewish people. It is absolutely vital that, we have as much Jewish Zionist Hebrew education as we can for our community. Now, of course, Americans in general are the, of all peoples in the world, we don't speak other languages. We are isolated from the rest of the world. And we're at a time when English is the international language. It's long since replaced French. That's certainly, it's a hard task. But we need more Jewish education of all sorts, and certainly Jewish Zionist education is key to the future of the American Jewish community. It's key to the future of the Jewish world. So yes, that must be emphasized. But it's not a determinative. It's not if we don't learn Hebrew, we can't support Israel. No, we can do it anyway. But you should definitely try and learn if you can.
Yeah, so with all the organizations nowadays that discuss Israel or try to educate on Israel, do you believe that we have so many organizations working independently on these issues that they end up not being as effective?
Well, we're talking about Jews, right?
Exactly.
So your question pretty much answers itself. The old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. 3 Israelis, 4 Israeli political parties. I don't know who for you to think that we're going to have less organizations and less divisiveness and less debate, you're talking about a different, ethnic, you're talking about a different people than the Jews. This is a given. It's part of who we are, and that's fine. More debate is good. A vibrant Jewish public square even if we're arguing with each other, is exactly what we need. We need people caring about, above all, and certainly as a journalist, I'm in the business of Jewish ideas. I'm in the idea business. I'm not in the partisan or politicians business. We need more debate and more urgency and more argument, argument as opposed to assertion, shall we say. Those are fine things. And, if a new Jewish organization, enters the alphabet soup world of Jewish organizations, yes, it will cause an eye roll from somebody like me who's like, yeah, I think we have enough organizations, truly. But that passion that causes people to found new organizations, because, and these organizations and the ones that survive and thrive are the ones that fill a niche. There's still plenty of underserved niches within the Jewish world. So I'm not going to knock anybody who wants to start something new to pursue a particular cause or a particular issue. That's not our problem. Our problem is people not caring about Jewish issues, not caring enough about Israel, not caring enough about Jewish rights or the whole panoply of Jewish civilization, being part of a Jewishly illiterate generation in this country. That's our problem, not too many organizations. I mean, that's my problem as a Jewish journalist, that there are too many organizations. That's not the Jewish people's problem.
You'll still have a warm place in your heart for our organization.
But not exclusively to all the members of other
Right.
organizations.
I believe we have time for one last question, so I'll try to merge two questions. How do you see the future for Israel remains strong with a seemingly decline in support for Democrats and by extension its Jewish supporters? And how do Israeli leaders cope with these problems?
Well, so many of us in the Jewish organizational world, and even, in the Anglo-Jewish press, we schrei Gewalt for a living. We're always talking about how terrible things are. And we certainly have problems and challenges in the United States. I've outlined the sort of debate within the Democratic Party, which is increasingly split on Israel. But let me go against the grain and give you some good news. The overwhelming majority of the American people are with us. Support for Zionism in Israel is baked deep into the political DNA of this country. The polls all show strong majorities of support for Israel and against its enemies. That's just a fact. We can highlight, as we should, the Ilhan Omars and the Rashida Tlaibs, and the instances when, certainly people in the Democratic Party or, outliers in the Republicans, are saying things that we don't like. And indeed, we have real issues with this administration, certainly, about its direction on Iran, its direction on the Palestinians. But the notion that, sometimes, we get into this apocalyptic view of history and of politics, and we see everything as the end of the world. The world isn't ending. Support for Israel isn't ending in this country. Yes, we have problems and challenges, maybe more than we had before, but the overwhelming majority of the American people are with us. As I talked about how the Republicans became a lockstep pro-Israel party, that didn't happen just because, AIPAC is really good, at advocacy, and the other Washington organizations like EMET do a good job, and they're Jewish donors. It happened because the overwhelming majority of non-Jewish Americans care about Israel. It's good politics to be pro-Israel, except in certain quarters. So we should remind ourselves that when we speak up for the rights of the Jewish people, for Israel's rights, for Israel's security, for the justice of Israel's cause, we are not alone. We have the support of our non-Jewish neighbors, sometimes far more ardent support than we get from our Jewish neighbors and family members and fellow congregants. Let's not forget that. And with that confidence, go forward, understanding that, yes, with God's help, but we're not losing this fight for Israel in this country. We're winning it. We'll continue to win it. Sometimes we have setbacks, and certainly there are real challenges and real reasons to worry about Israel's future in terms of existential threats from Iran. But we're not alone, and we're not losing. we speak up and we have support from broad sectors of other Americans. Israel, the United States is not a fundamentally anti-Semitic country. It's a philo-Semitic country. It's a pro-Israel country. And we should remember that every time we speak out on this issue. We're not alone and we're not losing.
Jonathan, I cannot thank you enough for your words of brilliance and encouragement, because, as you know, we at EMET are not always so popular because we speak up for Israel. Oftentimes in forums where our voices are not really welcome. And I want to ask all of our viewers today, we have almost 1,000 viewers, and we've had at least 68 questions that I could see that have popped up on the screen. I apologize. And I also want to ask all of our viewers to please support the work of JNS.org. It is a phenomenal paper. I'm not saying that because I write frequently for it, but because it is incredibly, incredibly valuable in getting the EMET, the truth out, that is not being taught on college campuses and that is not being heard in some of the forums of polite society, so to speak. I am really concerned about academia, because academia does influence millions of minds. And that's something that we've been working on in EMET for years and years and years. Back in 2005, we tried to address it by making an amendment to Title VI of the Higher Education Act for diversity of perspectives and a wide range of viewpoints in order to get a grant from a federal government to the Middle Eastern Studies programs. But unfortunately, it has done very, very little. And we're still trying to figure out a way to do that. There was a University of Arkansas study very recently that said that there is more anti-Semitism among, unfortunately, the college educated. So I need you to support JNS. I also really need you to support the work of EMET. We work incredibly hard. We are a staff of 4, and people think we're a staff of 400. All of us take on these very, very unpopular issues right now. We write and publish constantly. We have appointments on Capitol Hill almost every day. It's very important if everybody who tuned in just gave what you feel you could comfortably afford, we might be able to make up the deficit, because we have not been able to have our one fundraising event this year. Or last year because of COVID-19. So if you just go to emetonline.org and contribute whatever you feel is comfortable, we could probably be able to keep paying everyone's salaries throughout the year. Anyway, and Jonathan, I cannot thank you enough. As I said to you before, every time I read one of your articles, I find myself underlining every word and putting an exclamation point next to it. You are actually a gift to Israel and the Jewish people. And I ask you to just, keep strong and go forward. And I should also make a plug. Next week, we have Ephraim Invar, who is the founding director of the Israel Institute for Security and Strategy, and he is talking about whether or not the Biden administration and Israel are going to be on a collision course. And so please tune in next Wednesday, same time, same place, Wednesday at 12 noon. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me.